Officer James Mercer was not having a good day. The summer heat in Atlanta made his uniform stick to his skin, and he had already dealt with 3 domestic disputes before noon. His patience was wearing thin when the call came in about a minor traffic accident downtown. He pulled his patrol car up to the scene with a sigh. 2 vehicles stood on the side of the busy street, a white delivery truck and a black sedan that, while not flashy, was clearly well maintained. The truck driver, a young man in his 20s, was gesturing apologetically while a black woman in a tailored pantsuit stood with her arms crossed, looking at the damage to her car. "Afternoon, folks," Officer Mercer said, approaching them both. "What happened here?" The truck driver spoke first. "I was backing up to make a delivery, and I didn't see her car parked there. It was a small tap, really." The woman shook her head. "Officer, I was legally parked for over an hour while in a meeting. When I returned, I found this truck had backed into my vehicle. The impact was significant enough that I'm concerned about damage to the frame, not just the visible dent you can see here." Mercer walked around to examine the sedan. There was a dent in the rear passenger door, but nothing that looked serious to him. He'd seen much worse in his 15 years on the force. "Ma'am, this is just a small dent. These things happen all the time in the city," Mercer said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Nevertheless, I'd like a proper accident report filed," the woman said firmly. "And I'd like all potential damage documented." Mercer looked at his watch. He was already behind schedule, and this seemed like a waste of time. "Look, your insurance will cover a simple dent. We don't need to make a federal case out of this." He chuckled at his own choice of words. The woman's expression didn't change. "I understand you're busy, officer, but I have the right to file a police report for any accident, regardless of how minor you may think it is." Something about her composed manner irritated Mercer. Most people were either nervous or angry around police officers, but this woman seemed neither. She just stood there, expecting him to do his job. "Fine," he said, pulling out his report pad. "Name?" "Dr. Elaine Montgomery," she replied. Mercer scribbled it down carelessly. "Address?" As she provided her information, Mercer filled out the form with minimal detail, his writing sloppy. When he handed the truck driver his copy, he winked as if they shared an inside joke about difficult people. "You'll need to submit this to your insurance," Mercer told the woman, tearing off her copy. "They'll handle it from here." "Officer," Dr. Montgomery said, "you haven't properly documented the full extent of the damage, and you haven't taken any photographs." Mercer laughed. "Ma'am, I've been doing this job for 15 years. Trust me, this is a minor fender bender. Your insurance company isn't going to care about a few extra pictures of a small dent." Dr. Montgomery's expression remained calm, but her eyes hardened. "May I have your badge number, please?" Now Mercer rolled his eyes. "Sure thing. It's 4873. He tapped his name tag. "Officer James Mercer. Anything else I can help you with today?" "That will be all," Dr. Montgomery said, carefully folding the report and placing it in her purse. "Thank you for your time." As Mercer walked back to his patrol car, he shook his head. Some people just had to make everything difficult. He had no idea that this routine traffic stop was about to change the course of his career. 3 hours after the traffic incident, Officer James Mercer sat at his desk in the precinct, filing paperwork from his shift. The small encounter with Dr. Montgomery had already faded from his mind, just one of many routine calls he handled that day. "Mercer," called Surgeon Wilson from across the room. "Got a minute?" Mercer looked up from his computer screen. "Sure, what's up?" "That fender bender you handled on Peachtree Street. The woman with the sedan is on the phone. Says your report is incomplete, and she wants to speak with you." Mercer sighed loudly. "You got to be kidding me. It was just a tiny dent." "Well, she's not hanging up until she talks to you," Wilson said, holding out the phone. With obvious reluctance, Mercer took the call. "Officer Mercer speaking." "Officer, this is Dr. Elaine Montgomery," came the calm voice he recognized from earlier. "I'm calling because the accident report you filed is missing several critical details. The impact to my vehicle was more significant than you noted, and you failed to document the fact that my car was legally parked when it was struck." Mercer pressed his fingers against his temples, feeling a headache coming on. "Dr. Montgomery, I documented what I observed at the scene. If you have an issue with the truck driver's insurance, that's between you and them." "I understand that," she replied patiently. However, an accurate police report is essential for my insurance claim. Would it be possible for you to amend your report to include these details? Look, ma'am, Mercer said, not bothering to hide his frustration, I've been doing this job for a long time. What you're dealing with is a simple fender bender, nothing more. I can't change a report based on what you want it to say. There was a brief silence on the line. I see, Dr. Montgomery finally said. In that case, I'll need to speak with your supervisor about filing an amended report. Mercer let out a short laugh. You're welcome to do that, but just so you know, we get calls like this all the time from people trying to get bigger insurance payouts. It doesn't usually end up the way they hope. Are you suggesting I'm being dishonest, Officer Mercer? The woman's voice remained calm but had taken on a steely quality. I'm suggesting that people often think their cases deserve special treatment, but we have procedures for a reason. I'm not asking for special treatment, Dr. Montgomery replied. I'm asking for thorough and professional police work, which is what any citizen deserves. Mercer glanced around the busy precinct, growing impatient with the conversation. Well, like I said, you're welcome to speak to my supervisor. Is there anything else I can help you with today? No, that will be all, Dr. Montgomery said. Thank you for your time, Officer Mercer. I'll be in touch with your department shortly. Mercer hung up the phone and shook his head. Unbelievable, he muttered to himself. Problem? Asked Wilson, passing by his desk. Just someone who thinks her little fender bender is the crime of the century, Mercer replied. Says she's going to talk to the higher-ups. Good luck with that. Wilson raised an eyebrow. You never know who you're dealing with, Mercer. Might want to watch that attitude. Come on, Mercer said with a dismissive wave. She's just trying to squeeze more money from the insurance company. She'll get tired of calling and give up eventually. As he returned to his paperwork, Mercer put the incident out of his mind completely. He had no way of knowing that Dr. Montgomery was already typing an email to the police commissioner, or that her signature block included the title United States Court of Appeals, 11th Circuit. The storm that was about to break over Officer James Mercer's career was still gathering strength, invisible on his horizon. The next morning dawned bright and clear, but Officer James Mercer's day was about to turn very dark indeed. He had just settled at his desk with a cup of coffee when Captain Rodriguez appeared at his side with an unusually serious expression. My office. Now, the captain said quietly. Mercer followed his superior, puzzled by the tone. He racked his brain trying to think of what he might have done wrong. Was it the paperwork from the drunk driver case last week, or maybe the overtime he claimed on the Williams arrest? Captain Rodriguez closed the door behind them and pointed to a chair. Sit down, Mercer. The captain's desk was neat as always, but Mercer noticed a printed email sitting in the center, along with what looked like his accident report from yesterday. Do you remember a traffic incident you handled yesterday? Black sedan delivery truck? Mercer nodded. Yes, sir, just a minor fender bender. Woman was making a big deal out of a small dent. Captain Rodriguez's face tightened. That woman filed a formal complaint this morning. Not just with me, but with the commissioner and the mayor's office. Mercer felt his stomach drop. What? Why would she go that far over a simple accident report? Because, Rodriguez said slowly, the woman you dismissed so casually is Federal Judge Elaine Montgomery. The name hung in the air between them. Even Mercer, who paid little attention to the news, had heard that name. Judge Montgomery's appointment to the federal bench had been major news in Atlanta last year. Federal Judge? Mercer repeated, his voice suddenly dry. Captain Rodriguez slid the email across the desk. Judge Montgomery's complaint details, and I quote, dismissive and unprofessional conduct unbecoming of a police officer. She states that you laughed at her concerns, failed to properly document the accident, and implied she was being dishonest about the damage to her vehicle. Mercer's face flushed hot with embarrassment. I didn't know who she was, he said weakly. That's exactly the point, Mercer. Rodriguez's voice rose sharply. You shouldn't treat anyone that way, regardless of who they are. But the fact that you couldn't even recognize one of the most prominent legal figures in our city shows how little attention you pay to the community you're supposed to serve. Mercer stared at the floor, the gravity of the situation sinking in. What happens now? Internal Affairs wants to meet with you this afternoon. The Commissioner has requested a full review of your conduct and service record for the past 5 years, and Judge Montgomery has requested all body camera footage from your interaction. Mercer's head snapped up. My body cam? But You didn't turn it on, did you? Rodriguez's disappointment was palpable. That's another violation we'll have to address. Sir, this is just a misunderstanding. Mercer tried. I can explain to the judge. You won't be explaining anything to Judge Montgomery. Rodriguez cut him off. In fact, you are not to contact her in any way. This is now an official departmental investigation. The captain stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. You're on desk duty until further notice. I need your badge and service weapon. Mercer's hands trembled slightly as he unclipped his badge and removed his gun. 15 years on the force, and it had come to this. All because he couldn't be bothered to take a traffic accident seriously. As he placed them on the desk, his phone buzzed with a news alert. He glanced down to see a headline. Federal judge files complaint against Atlanta police officer, citing bias concerns. The press already has it. Mercer asked, his voice hollow. Judge Montgomery is news, Mercer. And now, unfortunately, so are you. Rodriguez gestured toward the door. Report to Internal Affairs at 2 p.m., and I suggest you start thinking very carefully about how you've been approaching your job. As Mercer left the office, officers throughout the precinct fell silent, watching him. The weight of their stares felt heavier than any burden he'd ever carried. That evening, Officer James Mercer sat alone in his small apartment, staring at the TV without really seeing it. The meeting with Internal Affairs had been grueling. 3 hours of questions about his conduct, his report-writing practices, and his treatment of citizens. They had pulled up his entire service record, noting several previous complaints about his attitude that he had dismissed as people being too sensitive. The bottle of beer in his hand had gone warm, forgotten as his mind replayed the events of the past 2 days over and over. How had everything fallen apart so quickly? His phone buzzed with another text from his partner, Officer Daniels. Hanging in there. News is all over this story. Mercer ignored it, just as he had ignored the previous 5 messages. What could he say? That he had messed up. That his career might be over because he couldn't be bothered to treat a citizen with basic respect. With a sigh, he opened his laptop and typed Judge Elaine Montgomery into the search bar. He should have done this research yesterday, before allowing his assumptions to guide his behavior. The search results loaded instantly. Judge Elaine Montgomery's official portrait showed the same woman he had dismissed so casually, now wearing judicial robes and a serious expression. He clicked on her biography. Judge Elaine Montgomery graduated first in her class from Harvard Law School, he read aloud to the empty room. Before her appointment to the federal bench, she served as a prosecutor specializing in civil rights violations, then as a district court judge for 10 years. Known for her fairness and attention to detail. Mercer winced at those last words. Attention to detail. No wonder she had been so upset about his sloppy accident report. He continued reading, learning about her landmark rulings, her reputation for giving every case careful consideration regardless of who was involved. One article mentioned how she had grown up in the same Atlanta neighborhood where Mercer now patrolled, raised by a single mother who worked 3 jobs. She earned her way to that federal bench, Mercer muttered to himself, and I treated her like she was nobody. Another article caught his eye, Judge Montgomery leads initiative on equity in policing. The piece detailed how she had worked with police departments across the state to develop better training on community engagement and bias recognition. Mercer felt a wave of shame wash over him. He had always prided himself on being one of the good ones, not racist, just practical. But now, forced to examine his own behavior, he couldn't avoid the uncomfortable truth. Would he have treated a white man in an expensive suit the same way? Would he have laughed and dismissed the concern so easily? He knew the answer, and it made him sick to his stomach. His phone rang, displaying Captain Rodriguez's number. Mercer stared at it for 3 rings before finally answering. Mercer, he said, his voice rough. The department has scheduled a disciplinary hearing for Monday, Rodriguez said without preamble. You'll need to prepare a statement. And fair warning, Judge Montgomery will be there. Mercer swallowed hard. Yes, sir. One more thing, Rodriguez added. Judge Montgomery is scheduled to speak at the community center tomorrow evening. part of her ongoing work with police departments on bias training. Might be worth attending, off duty, of course. After hanging up, Mercer returned to his computer, reading more about Judge Montgomery's work. For the first time in his 15 years as an officer, he began to truly consider how his actions affected the people he encountered each day. How many others had he dismissed or treated with less respect because of unconscious assumptions? As midnight approached, Mercer made a decision. He would attend Judge Montgomery's talk tomorrow, not to try to save his job, but because he genuinely needed to hear what she had to say. His career might be damaged beyond repair, but perhaps he could still learn from this mistake and become a better person, even if he was no longer a police officer. The community center was packed by the time Officer Mercer arrived. He had come in civilian clothes, jeans, and a button-down shirt, and took a seat in the back row, trying to remain inconspicuous. His palms were sweaty, and he felt strangely vulnerable without his uniform. The room fell silent as Judge Elaine Montgomery walked to the podium. She wore a simple navy blue suit, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. Even from a distance, Mercer could see the confidence in her posture, the natural authority she carried without effort. "Good evening," she began, her voice clear and measured. "Thank you all for coming tonight to discuss a topic that affects every member of our community, the relationship between law enforcement and the citizens they serve." Mercer shifted uncomfortably in his seat as she spoke about trust, respect, and the importance of recognizing unconscious bias. Though she never mentioned him by name, he felt certain parts of her speech were influenced by their encounter. When an officer dismisses a citizen's concerns, Judge Montgomery said at one point, they're not just creating a negative interaction, they're reinforcing the idea that some voices matter less than others, that some citizens don't deserve the full protection of the law. The words hit Mercer like a physical blow. In 15 years, he had never thought of it that way. After the talk ended, Mercer slipped out quickly, not wanting to be recognized. But as he walked across the parking lot, a voice called after him. "Officer Mercer." He turned to find Captain Rodriguez walking toward him. "Sir, I didn't expect to see you here," Rodriguez finished for him. "I'm surprised, and honestly, a little impressed that you showed up." Mercer looked down at his shoes. "I needed to hear it." Rodriguez nodded slowly. "The disciplinary hearing is still happening Monday, but I'll note your attendance tonight in my report." The weekend passed in a blur of anxiety. Mercer prepared his statement, deleted it, and wrote it again several times. In the end, he decided to speak from the heart rather than reading from notes. Monday morning arrived cold and rainy. The hearing room at police headquarters felt smaller than Mercer remembered from previous disciplinary meetings he had attended as a witness. This time, he sat alone at a table facing 5 senior officers, including Captain Rodriguez. To the side sat Judge Montgomery, her expression unreadable. Chief Williams opened the proceedings. "Officer James Mercer, you are here today to address a formal complaint regarding your conduct during a traffic incident on June 15th. The complaint alleges dismissive behavior, failure to properly document an accident scene, and possible bias in your treatment of a citizen. How do you respond?" Mercer stood, his legs shaky beneath him. "I don't contest the complaint, sir." A murmur ran through the room. Most officers fought complaints vigorously. "I treated Judge Montgomery with disrespect," Mercer continued, his voice growing steadier. "I dismissed her concerns without proper investigation. I failed to follow department protocols for accident documentation. And yes, I believe now that unconscious bias played a role in how I approached the situation." He turned slightly to face Judge Montgomery directly. "My behavior was unprofessional and wrong. It reflected poorly not just on me, but on this entire department. I can only say that I'm committed to learning from this mistake." The room fell silent as he sat down. Chief Williams cleared his throat. "Officer Mercer, the department has reviewed your service record, which shows several previous complaints of a similar nature, though none as serious as this one. Given the pattern of behavior and the high-profile nature of this incident, we have determined that appropriate disciplinary action includes a 2-week suspension without pay, mandatory completion of our enhanced bias training program, and 6 months of probationary status with regular review." Mercer nodded, accepting the punishment that could have been much worse. As the hearing concluded, Mercer noticed Judge Montgomery watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not forgiveness, certainly, but perhaps something like recognition of his willingness to take responsibility. What he didn't know was that his case was already being added to the training materials for new officers across the department. A powerful example of how quickly things could go wrong when bias was allowed to guide police work. 2 weeks of suspension gave Officer James Mercer plenty of time to think. He had spent days sitting in his apartment, replaying his encounter with Judge Montgomery in his mind. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout his career, he had developed habits and attitudes that needed to change. On a rainy Tuesday morning, Mercer sat in the waiting room outside Judge Montgomery's chambers at the federal courthouse. His palms were sweaty, and he kept adjusting his tie. He had worn a suit rather than his uniform, wanting to meet her as James Mercer the man, not Officer Mercer the policeman. "Judge Montgomery will see you now," her assistant said, opening the heavy wooden door. Mercer stood, took a deep breath, and walked into the office. The room was impressive but not flashy. Walls lined with law books, simple but elegant furniture, and large windows overlooking downtown Atlanta. Judge Montgomery sat behind her desk, reading through a document. She looked up as he entered. "Officer Mercer," she said, her voice neutral. "Please have a seat." "Thank you for agreeing to see me, Your Honor," Mercer said, sitting in the chair across from her desk. "I'll admit, I was surprised by your request," Judge Montgomery said, folding her hands on her desk. "What can I do for you today?" Mercer had rehearsed this moment dozens of times, but now that he was here, the carefully planned words seemed inadequate. "I came to apologize to you in person," he began. "Not because I have to, or because I think it will save my job, but because you deserve to hear it directly from me." Judge Montgomery's expression remained unchanged, but she nodded slightly for him to continue. "When we met that day, I didn't treat you with the respect that every citizen deserves. I was dismissive, unprofessional, and I failed to do my job properly." Mercer paused, making himself maintain eye contact despite his discomfort. "And I've been honest enough with myself to recognize that if you had been a white man in an expensive suit, I probably would have acted differently." The judge studied him for a moment. "That's a difficult admission to make, Officer Mercer." "It's the truth," he replied simply. "I've spent these past weeks really looking at myself and my behavior. I'm not proud of what I've seen." Judge Montgomery leaned back slightly in her chair. "You know, I've spent much of my career working on issues of bias in our justice system. I've heard hundreds of apologies from officials who were caught doing something wrong. Most of them are sorry they got caught. Few are truly sorry for their actions." "I understand that," Mercer said, "and I don't expect you to forgive me or withdraw your complaint. That's not why I'm here." "Then why are you here, Officer Mercer?" He hadn't expected this question. "I guess I wanted you to know that your complaint didn't just lead to disciplinary action. It led to real reflection, and I'm committed to changing how I approach my job." For the first time, Judge Montgomery's expression softened slightly. "That's a start." She stood up and walked to a bookshelf, pulling down a thin volume. "This is a collection of personal accounts from citizens who have experienced bias in their interactions with law enforcement. Some of the stories are difficult to read. I'd like you to have it." Mercer accepted the book with surprise. "Thank you, Your Honor." "The issue is bigger than just you and me, Officer Mercer," she said, returning to her desk. "What happened between us is happening in small ways across this city every day. The difference is, most people don't have the platform I do to make their complaints heard." Mercer nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I know my apology doesn't fix the problem, but I want to be part of the solution going forward." "Actions speak louder than words, Officer Mercer," Judge Montgomery replied. "I'll be watching to see what you do with this experience." As Mercer stood to leave, he felt something shift inside him. This meeting wasn't the end of something, it was the beginning. Whether his career survived or not, he had a responsibility to do better, to be better. "Thank you for your time, Judge Montgomery," he said. "Good day, Officer Mercer," she replied, already turning her attention back to her work. The message was clear. Their conversation was over, but his journey was just beginning. Officer James Mercer returned to work after his suspension with a new perspective. The precinct felt different somehow, or perhaps he was the one who had changed. As he walked through the door in his freshly pressed uniform, conversations quieted and eyes followed him. The story of his encounter with Judge Montgomery had spread throughout the department. "Welcome back," said Officer Daniels, his longtime partner. "How you holding up?" "I'm okay," Mercer replied. "Just ready to get back to work." Captain Rodriguez called him into his office before he could even reach his desk. "Mercer, got a minute?" Inside the office, Rodriguez motioned for him to sit down. "I've made some changes to your assignments during your probationary period." Mercer nodded, expecting the worst. "Maybe desk duty for 6 months, or traffic detail at busy intersections, the usual punishment assignments. Starting today, you'll be assisting Sergeant Williams with the community outreach program in the 4th Ward," Rodriguez said, sliding a folder across the desk. Mercer looked up in surprise. The 4th Ward was primarily Black and Hispanic, an area where police-community relations have been strained for years. "Sir, this isn't a punishment, Mercer. It's an opportunity," Rodriguez explained. "The department is implementing new training on community engagement and bias recognition. We need officers who understand why this matters." "And you think I'm the right person for that?" Mercer asked incredulously. "I think you're someone who's had a wake-up call," Rodriguez replied. "Sometimes the officers who learn the hardest lessons become the best teachers." That afternoon, Mercer found himself at the 4th Ward Community Center, the same place where he had heard Judge Montgomery speak. This time, he was in uniform, helping Sergeant Williams set up chairs for a community meeting. "Word of advice," Williams said as they worked. "Just listen tonight. Don't get defensive, even if some of what you hear is hard to take." The meeting room filled quickly with local residents, parents, small business owners, community leaders, and teenagers. Mercer stood at the back, feeling the weight of suspicious glances. Sergeant Williams opened the meeting. "We're here tonight to discuss how we can improve police presence in the 4th Ward. This is about you telling us what you need, and us listening." For the next 2 hours, Mercer did exactly that, listened. He heard stories about harassment, about calls for help that went unanswered, about young men afraid to walk home at night not because of criminals, but because of police. He heard about elderly residents who didn't trust officers enough to report crimes, about mothers who taught their children to fear the very people who should protect them. One woman stood up near the end of the meeting. "My son was stopped 3 times last month just walking home from his job. Same street, same time, different officers. Each time, they said he fit a description." "What description is that?" "Young black man existing in public." The room fell silent, waiting for the police response. Williams looked at Mercer and nodded slightly. Mercer stepped forward, heart pounding. "Ma'am, I can't defend that. You're right to be angry. All I can say is that I'm here because I want to do better, and I want our department to do better." To his surprise, the woman nodded. "That's a start. But we need more than words." "You're right," Mercer agreed. "Can I ask your son's name and when he usually walks home? I'd like to make sure our patrol officers know he's a resident just trying to get home from work." After the meeting, Williams clapped him on the shoulder. "Not bad, Mercer. You didn't try to make excuses. That's rare for cops in these meetings." Over the next few weeks, Mercer became a regular presence in the 4th Ward. He walked the beat instead of driving, learning shopkeepers' names and greeting residents. He started coaching at the youth center twice a week, teaching kids basketball while building relationships. When the department launched its new bias training program, Captain Rodriguez asked Mercer to speak about his experience. Standing before a room of his fellow officers, Mercer felt nervous but determined. "6 months ago, I thought I was doing my job just fine," he began. "Then I met a federal judge who I treated like our concerns didn't matter. It could have ended my career. Instead, it changed my perspective. Let me tell you what I've learned." 1 year had passed since Officer James Mercer's encounter with Judge Elaine Montgomery. The autumn leaves were turning in Atlanta as Mercer patrolled the 4th Ward neighborhood on foot. The area had become his regular beat, and the changes in both the community and himself were remarkable. Morning, Officer Mercer called Mrs. Jenkins as she swept the sidewalk in front of her bakery. "You want your usual coffee today?" "Thanks, Mrs. Jenkins," Mercer replied with a smile. "That would be great." A year ago, residents of this neighborhood would have watched him pass with suspicion. Now, many greeted him by name. It hadn't been easy. Trust took time to build, especially where it had been broken repeatedly. But Mercer had shown up consistently, listened more than he spoke, and followed through on his promises. His radio crackled to life. All units near Ponce and Highland, we have a two-vehicle collision, possible injuries. This is Officer Mercer. I'm 3 blocks away, responding now. He jogged toward the scene, arriving to find a delivery van and a small blue car with damaged front ends. Both drivers stood on the sidewalk, visibly shaken but apparently uninjured. Is everyone okay? Mercer asked, approaching them both with equal attention. The delivery driver, a young white man, nodded. I think so. It happened so fast. The other driver, an elderly black woman, seemed more distressed. My chest hurts a little. And my car. I just paid it off last month. Let's get you checked out first, Mercer said kindly, helping her sit down on a nearby bench. I've called for an ambulance just to be safe. He took statements from both drivers and 3 witnesses, carefully documenting every detail in his notebook. He photographed the scene from multiple angles, measured skid marks, and checked nearby traffic cameras that might have captured the collision. You're being very thorough, the elderly woman observed as Mercer crouched down to examine the damage to her car. It's my job, ma'am, he replied simply. Everyone deserves the same care and attention. As Mercer finished his report, a black SUV pulled up near the scene. He glanced up, then did a double take as Judge Elaine Montgomery stepped out of the vehicle. She was dressed casually today, looking like any other citizen running weekend errands. Their eyes met briefly across the street. For a moment, Mercer wondered if she recognized him. Then she gave a small nod of acknowledgement before continuing on her way. That simple gesture, the recognition between 2 people who had once been adversaries, filled Mercer with an unexpected sense of pride. She had seen him doing his job properly, treating each citizen with respect and professionalism. It felt like closing a circle. Later that evening, Mercer sat at his desk completing his accident report. Captain Rodriguez stopped by, looking over his shoulder at the detailed documentation. Nice work, Mercer, he said. Hard to believe this is the same officer who couldn't be bothered to write up a minor fender bender a year ago. Mercer smiled slightly. Different officer, sir. In many ways. The department's bias complaint numbers are down 12% in your patrol area, Rodriguez noted. And community meeting attendance is up. Whatever you're doing, it's working. After finishing his shift, Mercer changed into civilian clothes and headed to the community center for the weekly youth basketball program he now helped coach. As he walked through the neighborhood, he reflected on how much had changed in just 1 year. His career hadn't ended with that disciplinary hearing. Instead, a new path had opened, one where he could be the kind of officer he should have been all along. The encounter with Judge Montgomery had been painful and humbling, but necessary. As he approached the community center, he saw the kids already warming up inside. They waved excitedly when they spotted him through the window. These relationships, built on respect, consistency, and genuine care, were the real measure of his progress. The lesson he had learned from Judge Montgomery had changed not just how he did his job, but how he saw the world and his place in it. Every citizen deserved to be treated with dignity, regardless of who they were or what they looked like. It had taken a federal judge to teach him that lesson, but he was determined to never forget it again.